Warning! Be prepared for a quite long introductory speech. Just skip it if you are impatient. This video is different from those that I usually produce. The reason is the machine itself, the piece of gear I'm going to talk about today, the CMI-V, the software version of the legendary Fairlight computer musical instrument, in short CMI. There is something magical about this machine, something nearly extra-mundane. If you belong to those who are telling me that there are more powerful, more capable, faster and more sophisticated and a lot better pieces of gear out there, better samplers equipped with a lot more of functionality and additive synthesizers which are a lot easier to deal with and so on, well, then I agree with you. You are perfectly right. So, why do I spend my time with this software Fairlight? Well, there is something magical about this machine, something nearly extra mundane. I could, of course, start showing and talking about well-known sounds from hundreds of songs from the 1980s, but I won't do that. I could dive deep into the machine and explain the smallest details of each of its functions, but I won't do that either. Instead, I'm going to make use of two features of the CMI-V, which I have not found being mentioned anywhere else on the internet. The first of which is its specific kind of simplicity that encourages us to experiment with the sounds we have, to do things we wouldn't normally try. But it's the same simplicity which is able to change a rather boring sound into something very interesting quite often, and always completely unexpectedly. You change a parameter, you push a button, and bang, you are blown away by what you get. I mentioned magic some time ago, didn't I? The second of the features I'm talking about is its capability to give us insight and understanding of how sound works and of the most fundamental and most important mechanisms how to manipulate with sound, and that in a very vivid and completely unacademic but practical way. There is this fast Fourier Transform thing, for example, just an example. You know this algorithm which analyzes even the most complex sounds and breaks them down into a bunch of simple sine waves, to describe it on the quick. You've heard the term, but most of you back off seeing all the mathematics behind it. The CMI-V and we are going to change your attitude, because you will see FFT live and in action. Or what about carving out the fundamental character of a certain sound and describing it in a useful way, a way that makes you suddenly understand the full potential of the sound you are looking at and you are listening to, so that you get a better notion of how and where to use it in your own productions, or how to change this pure sound into music. Forget about all of these useless and meaningless terms like crazy, cool, fat, and so on. You will not need them anymore. And if you want to get an idea of what additive synthesis is and what it is capable of, then there is no easier tool to give you what you want than the CMI-V, including all painfulness, of course, which classical additive synthesis comes along with. And if you want to feel like Michael Jackson, for example, similarly enthusiastic about sound and musical details, well, you are sitting in front of the machine, of exactly the machine he and his team forged their most famous sounds with. They, as well as nearly every other professional musician in the 1980s. Oh yes, my wife is right. I should start with the tutorial now. There's one thing I must mention before I start. There is something magical about this machine, something nearly extra mundane. I'm not going to talk about the functionality of the CMI a lot. There is a series of tutorials about the matter on YouTube. They are made by Arturia themselves, and they are very helpful and quite comprehensive. But you don't need to watch them to be able to follow and to understand this video of mine today. I'll give you all the information concerning functionality that is needed. Wake up! My introductory speech has ended. The CMI comes along with 3 ways of generating sound called modes, 2 of which can interact, can exchange their data. These 2 are the sampler and the so-called time synth. The third, the spectral synth, is isolated from the other 2 sources. So let me import a sound file, a sample, into the mode called, well, sampling, of course. I can do so by simply dragging the file from my hard disk folder onto one of the 10 instrument slots at the bottom of the GUI, or by clicking on the little folder symbol of one of the instrument slots to load it from my hard disk. I choose the drag and drop method. Well, and the other method. This time I import the sound of a cello. The sample mode is simple and easy. Everything is quite straightforward. There are no sophisticated functions hiding under the hood. The available parameters are sample start and sample length, loop on, loop forwards and backwards, loop start and loop end. We can change these parameters while holding down a key on our MIDI controller or during the length of a note from the DAW. The CMI follows these changes at once and doesn't need a new note on MIDI message. I'll return to the sampling functionalities a bit later, but now I want to transfer the cello sample to the second mode, to the time synth mode of the CMI. To do so, I change from the Control subpage to the Edit subpage and push the Analyze button. The CMI executes a so-called fast Fourier transform, and the result is to be seen and heard in the time synth mode. But hey, what's that? The sound got worse. There are a lot of artifacts in it now. Let's compare the 2 versions, the one in the sample player and the one in the time synth. We hear that what I called artifacts is nothing else than the remnants of the noise which is in the original sample. And even remnants is not the correct term here. These sounds in the time synth that remind of water drops is the attempt of the CMI to gain something musical from the noise which the sample contains. There isn't any noise in the time synth version of the sample anymore. Well, the process of converting the wave file, WAV file, the sample, to a synthesizer file in the time synth has got some parameters. We will have to deal with them, but again a bit later in this video. At first, I want to go the other way, the opposite direction. I want to convert the time synth file back to a sample. Will the noise be back again? Well, let's try it. And yes, the noise is back, but let me call them artifacts again, are now in the sample as well. If we analyzed both the noise as well as the artifacts, we would discover that the noise in the sample has changed. It is warmer than the noise in the original, and the artifacts are a bit more tonal than in the time synth. I'm going to deal with all of these phenomena in detail, but again later. I'm still doing a fast walkthrough to show you some certain specifics, some interesting behavior of the CMI at the moment. Let me repeat the last steps with a simple and super clean sine wave now. I import the sine wave, the wave file, into the sampler. Then I let the CMI convert it to a synthesizer file in the time synth, and then I change to the Edit subpage and change the wave selection from sine to saw. And I get the warmest saw wave I've heard for a very long time. Just to make it clear and to avoid a misconception, what the CMI did when I changed from sine to saw was not a kind of wave shaping. The machine didn't take the sine wave and converted it to a saw wave. The machine recalculated the algorithm that produces the sound from the ground up, completely new. In other words, a purely sterile digital sound generating process leads to a warmer kind of saw wave than with a lot of purely analog gear. Please keep that in mind. We will meet several similar phenomena with the CMI a bit later. But it's time now for some explanations concerning the time synth, what it is, how it works, and how we can make the most use of it. Well, the time synth is an additive synthesizer, meaning it generates a couple of individual sine waves, one of which determines the pitch of the sound, for example, which note you play, the others determine the sound. Let's look at the spectrum of the sound of a string instrument. We see a lot of single frequencies there. The lowest of the dominant peaks, the dominant frequencies, determines the pitch of the sound. All the rest determine whether the sound which I'm playing sounds like a string instrument, or rather like a brass, or like a saxophone, or like a lorry full of glass having an accident. Let me use another sound, a bass sound, to introduce some terms. The individual frequencies in the spectrum are called partials. The lowest one, the one determining the pitch, is called the fundamental. Each of the partials represents a sine wave of the frequency of the corresponding partial. A sine wave, as you will know, carries only one single frequency in its spectrum. Therefore, each of the partials of a spectrum of whatever sound can be generated by sine waves of certain frequencies. But when we look at the spectrum of our cello again, we see that not only there are lots of these partials, but there is also a lot of action going on. The partials are permanently changing their amplitudes. When we want to synthesize the sound of a cello, we will have to layer a lot of sine waves, and each of these sine waves will have to change its amplitude in a certain way, the way the frequencies in the spectrum of the cello change their amplitudes. It's going to get cumbersome. Well, that's classic additive synthesis. Fortunately, there is this FFT thing, the Fourier Fast Transform, which does all the work for us. Really all the work? Well, not with the CMI and not if we want a perfect replication of the sample in the sample mode. One of the reasons for the imperfectness of the CMI's FFT performance is the limited number of possible partials of possible sine waves. There are only 32 of them on offer, and that is a very limited number indeed. Other synths, other software that aims to replicating a wave file or in general a sample as perfect as possible and offering additive synthesis data formats at the same time have 212 or even 2024 sine wave generators or even more on board. It's not the intention of the CMI-V to mimic a sampled sound in a perfect way, of course. It's the creative overhaul of a sound that we shall have in mind when we take to the CMI. And here, its time synth mode offers a nice way to deal with the very details of a given sound. And soon the time will come when you are very happy about the fact that there are only 32 sine waves to deal with. But let's discover how this time synth works. To do so, I'm not going to convert an important sample. I start from scratch, from zero, with no sound at all. The Edit subpage of the time synth contains the graphic board, the grid where I can draw things in, the segments slots where I can determine the maximal length of my sound and the basic unit, the waveform one individual partial shall represent. I choose a sine wave at first, just to follow our one partial equals one frequency equals one sine wave philosophy. And I want the sound to be longer. There is more to say about segments and length and so on, but I will do this later. I start with the fundamental partial number 1, which is represented by slot 1 and the amplitude pointer above it. When we move the cursor across all 32 slots, the oscillograph shows their content. It's all sine waves, what we see, unsurprisingly, as I have chosen sines a minute ago, but their frequency increases the further up the line of slots I go. When I hit a key on my MIDI controller now, the pointer above slot 1 goes up and stays there, while the time pointer in the graph walks through all segments until it reaches segment 1000. But I want the sound to start at once, without any attack time, and pull the drawn point completely to the left, to the beginning of the sound. The fundamental shall sustain until the end of my keystroke, until the end of a note. But it shall get weaker and weaker. I draw the amplitude's envelope down until it reaches 0 at segment 1000. Now for the next partial. Its amplitude shall be a bit lower than that of the fundamental, and it shall die away a bit faster. Okay, let me draw it. The oscilloscope shows us what we have already heard. The beginning of the sound is distorted. I reduce the amplitude of the first partial a bit to avoid this. And I go for the next partial. And again, it shall be a bit less prominent, and it shall go down even faster than partial number 2. Again, I notice distortion. Well, adding partials to the sound is adding energy, adding volume to the whole sound. I reduce the amplitude's gain, but I divide the reduction between partials 1 and partial 2 because I don't want the fundamental to get too weak. There is another way called gain to do the same in an easier way, but later more about that. I continue doing so until I have 10 partials drawn in. The result is a kind of saw wave. It's a quite soft and warm one because of the missing of even higher partials and because of the way the maximum of the amplitudes is lower from partial to partial. But, well, all in all, the sound is a bit boring. Each partial starts at 0 time and goes down continuously and straight. I change this and let the different partials go up and down a bit at different times, all but for the fundamental. Let me play the sound an octave higher and in chords. And, well, a bit more interesting indeed. But, the changes of the amplitudes have bad timing. Some are happening too fast, others too slow, and some come simply at the wrong moment. I would have to adjust every single point in the graph of each partial. Okay, there are only 10 partials. It would take some minutes, but impossible? No, it is not impossible. Do you see the problematic with classical additive synthesis? Even using all of the available 32 partials and tweaking the breakpoints in the graph would get me into a very time-consuming situation. And now, imagine the 516 or the 2024, 512 and 2024, or even more partials in up-to-date big additive synthesizers using this way of additive synthesis. You can tweak even the smallest detail in a sound using this technique, but it's extremely cumbersome. The CMI offers some easing in that I copy and paste a once drawn envelope and transfer it to different partials that way. Then I can make some small tweaks, some small adjustments if necessary, without having to redraw the whole envelope. But still, it becomes cumbersome and hard work quite fast. Well, it's early old-school additive synthesis. Its power and magic lies in its ability to deeply intervene in a sound and to manipulate even the smallest details, but it doesn't have the charming face of the comfortably usable instruments of today's. In all of my examples so far, each of the 32 slots contained a single sine wave, a single frequency, a single partial. That's what I called the one slot equals one sine equals one frequency equals one partial rule. Let me change this and choose the option SAW in the wavetable voice window. We see and hear that we get a new rule which reads one slot equals one SAW wave equals a lot of partials equals a lot of frequencies. And as we see, there are already all possible partials in the spectrum. Well, it's a SAW wave, and SAW waves do have all of these partials in the spectrum. Well, I should be more precise. All partials means all partials which the Fairlight was and the CMIV is able to generate, meaning the frequency of each partial is an integer multiple of the fundamental, 1 times, 2 times, 3 times, and so on, the fundamental's frequency. And that's another thing that more up-to-date additive synths use to have. We can tune each partial individually. With the CMI-V, we cannot. But back to our SAW waves in each partial slot of the machine. There are all possible partials in the spectrum, but I cannot change a single one of them. I can only manipulate the SAW wave spectrum as a whole. So what is this function good for then? Well, I can construct quite complex sounds faster and without having to deal with each partial individually, of course. So what happens when I add a second set of SAW wave partials by activating slot 2? Let's try it. We see that some partials have got a remarkable higher amplitude now. Only the fundamental keeps unchanged. The new spectrum, the spectrum on the right, the spectrum with 2 activated SAW waves, looks a bit like a comb, with every second tooth being a bit longer than its neighbors. Let me quickly explain, because it's important to take in the principle. I reduce the amplitudes in slot 1 and slot 2 alternately to demonstrate the goings-on. we have two spectra at the same time. The spectrum of the, let me call it, fundamental saw wave in slot 1 and the second spectrum of the saw wave in slot 2, whose basic frequency is exactly 1 octave higher than that in slot 1. Let me show it even in numbers. We know that going 1 octave up means doubling the frequency. Giving the fundamental of the first saw wave the frequency 1 leads to these two rows of frequencies representing the two spectra which are present in the CMI at the moment. In each row, the frequencies are integer multiples of the basic frequency, the first one in the row. And the resulting spectrum is simply the sum of both. The amplitudes of frequencies which are present in both spectra add up. I gave the color red to these frequencies, and so we get the comb-like spectrum from before. And so we can handle a whole saw wave spectrum as if it was a single partial. Let me add some more saw waves and let me give them some envelopes, just as I did with the single frequencies of our sine waves before. Or what about this? It took some time drawing, though. Let's have a look at the other available waves in the wavetable voice window. I activate the normalize function in the segments window to increase the level so that we can see even weaker partials a bit better. At first, the sine waves. The differences between sine, 12-bit sine, and even 8-bit sine are minimal and don't matter in most of the situations. But the 4-bit sine wave shows remarkably more artifacts, which can be of musical use sometimes. I start with the sine wave and freeze the spectrum to compare. The difference between the saw wave and the square wave is, of course, the reduced amplitude of every second partial, every even partial, the second, the fourth, and so on. In super clean and sterile square waves, these partials are missing completely. but here only their levels are reduced. The wave called metallizer is a kind of triangle wave, and the so-called PWM is a mixture of a square wave and a saw wave. The wave called square cut-off resembles a sine wave. Well, it is that kind of wave which you get when you send a square wave through a low-pass filter and reduce the filter's cut-off frequency. The so-called ultrasaw is the result of a combination of two saw waves. You would get a similar result with the hard sync function of most synthesizers. I have to talk about terminology now before I come to more, let's say, magical aspects of the CMI. First, partial and harmonic. I have used the term partial in this video, whereas the Arturia tutorials talk of harmonics. Is it the same? No, it isn't. A partial is any frequency which is in the spectrum of a sound. A partial is a harmonic partial, or in short, simply harmonic, when it is an integer multiple of the fundamental of the sound. The next one is not that easy, and it's Arturia themselves who make it a bit difficult. I'm talking about the terms segment and sample. There is a bit of a mess in Arturia's videos and documentation concerning these terms, but I'll try to make it as easy as possible. In the PDF manual, they call a certain number of samples a segment, with the default value of 128 samples per segment. A bit later in the manual, they call a waveform, like for example a saw wave, or the more complex ultrasaw, a segment. And in Arturia's tutorial video number 3, the relation of samples and segments is even completely the other way around when it is said that in the sub-window of the time synth called segments, we can set the number of segments in the sample. All right, let's tidy up a bit. The term sample can have two different meanings in the documentation. Let me call it a macroscopic one and a microscopic one. In the macroscopic meaning, a sample is the whole sound, the whole goings-on in an instrument slot. That may be a drum sequence or some seconds of an ambient soundscape or a sample of a cello playing a single note or simply a sine wave. In the microscopic meaning, a sample is like a photo of the whole sound at a certain moment, a moment frozen in time, a small part of the whole goings-on. There is no development, no movement going on. And a segment, well, it's like a shorter or longer stop-motion picture containing more or less of these photos. And the macroscopic sample is the sum of all these stop-motion films being played back one after the other in the sampler. And the more microscopic samples, the more of these photos a segment, this stop-motion picture has, the longer is it, of course. And the longer each of these segments, each of these stop-motion pictures are, the longer, the longer lasts the whole macroscopic sample, the whole sound in the instrument slot. Voila, that's it. Let's go and do some magic now. Stop. I have to mention just one more thing to avoid a misconception. We could think that increasing the number of those microscopic samples in a segment might increase the resolution of the sound, but this is not the case. Increasing the number of samples per segment of an existing sound in the instrument slot simply adds copies of the last photograph, let's say photograph, to the sound. The last thing we heard in the shorter sample will simply sound ahead, sound on, sound a bit longer, according to the number of samples per segment that we have added. And reducing the number of microscopic samples in a segment makes the CMI brutally cut off the end of the macroscopic sample, the sound, in the instrument slot, which sometimes can make a lot of musical use and sense. And even increasing the number to its former value doesn't recover the lost parts of the sample. But we can nicely make use of this behavior when we want to use the beginning of a sample as it is and change the sonic content of the sound or of the last part of the sample. Where's the magic now? We want magic. Yes, okay. Magical workflow then. I'll start with the so-called spectral synth. It's a simple and easy-to-use instrument. We can generate up to 32 partials, like with the time synth, but we cannot really tweak these partials, at least not the individual ones. There are only 4 parameters: the position of the center partial, the numbers of partials to the left and to the right of the center partial, the bias to the left and to the right of the center partial, and the boost of the fundamental. And we can choose between the well-known wave shapes per depicted column again. That's all. It's not a mighty instrument at all. But it's extremely helpful finding the sound you want to create. Extremely helpful. Because there are only such a few ways to manipulate the sound, you come to a result which at least slightly resembles the sound you are aiming for in no time. When you have it, just go and record it in your DAW. Unfortunately, there isn't any direct way to get sound from the spectral synth to the sample player or the time synth. Now import the recorded sound in the sample player, convert it to a time synth file, and tweak the details then until you have exactly what you want. It's a lot faster than building it up from scratch or searching for a similar sound to get tweaked in your more or less well-organized collections of samples. As a side effect, you get interesting variations of the details of the sound through re-importing and converting it sometimes. An example. I show the spectral synth sound at first, then the re-imported version in the sample player, and then the converted re-import in the time synth. From here on, the tweaking of details can begin. It's a good idea to reset some of the partials which contain a lot of artifacts sometimes, but please be careful not to reset all partials by accident. And according to what you are aiming for, deleting some of the peaks may also help to, well, calm down the sound a bit. A last example shall be enough for today. I don't want to go too deep into additive sound design here. I did a lot of importing sound files and of converting them to timesynth files. We must talk about some general settings now. Settings which remarkably influence the result of these processes. These settings are BitDepth, gain, sample rate, and filter settings on the Edit subpage of the sampler, and the filter and channel settings in the Convert section of this page. Gain, BitDepth, filter low and filter high are functions concerning only the playback of the sample in the instrument slot and the data that is transferred to the timesynth. They don't have any influence on the import of a sample. Let me demonstrate the influence of BitDepth on playback and converting at first. Please notice also the different influences of the gain parameter at different BitDepth settings. And now converting. We hear that the BitDepth has a certain influence of the converting process, but it is not that big as the difference in the played back sound might make us expect it. it would be. And now the sample rate. At first, only playback at different rates, then converting at different rates. And here the influence on the convert process is remarkable. But what do bit depth and sample rate really do? Can we predict the result of the process of converting at different values of these parameters somehow? I did a tutorial about that matter for the members of our Rofil-MediaNet community in Modular City some months ago. Let me show you how I explained bit depth and sample rate in this tutorial. Let's recall what the bit depth means when we talk about converting digital and analog audio into each other. The whole process contains two main steps, sampling and quantization. In the first step, the sampling, the converter takes photographs, let me call it photographs, of the audio curve, or to say it less figuratively, the converter stores the positive or negative voltage of the curve at a certain moment. How often the converter takes these photos is determined by the sampling rate. The higher the sampling rate, the better is the quality of the sampling process. Just for the in-depth and in-detail thinking kind of guys of you, some people depict the result of a series of taken samples like that. That's wrong. The region between two consecutive samples is simply not defined at all. But our computers cannot deal with the gained amounts of voltage directly, therefore the second main step has to be done, the quantization. We could call it even the rounding off between two possible levels. You'll know this from your glorious days at math classes at school. 2.8 gets 3, but 2.4 gets 2, and so on. In this example, there are only two possible levels, 3 and 2. It's a rather coarse quantization, far too coarse, too rough for getting good results with audio. When we talk about audio voltage, two levels means only plus or minus. The bit depth determines the quality of the quantization because it determines how many possible levels of rounding off there are. Two levels corresponds to a bit depth of 1. With each additional bit depth, the amount of possible levels doubles. 2-bit depth means 2-bit bit depth means 4 possible levels, 3-bit means 8 possible levels, 4-bit means 16 possible levels, and so on. Well, did you notice what I said about bit depth? Bit depth of 1? There are only two possible levels at this bit depth, full power or no power. And that's the reason why at bit depth of 1, the gain slider makes no point, is useless, and we have only the full volume or none at all. But a far more interesting result with bit depth 1 is, for example, that a sine wave gets a square when sampled with bit depth 1. The original wave first, then the sampling result at a bit depth of 1, and then step by step a higher bit depth. We can nicely see what I meant in the video when I was talking about rounding up values. Perhaps it's more helpful for predicting the results of sampling at different bit depths and different sample rates when I put the information I gave in the video in a different form. The sample rate, the number of photographs taken per second, how many details along the time axis, along the x-axis the result will contain. The sample rate sets how many details, whereas the bit depth determines how precise along the level axis, along the y-axis, these photographs are taken. You will be able to do your sampling work with a CMI a bit more purposeful now, I think. Just a last hint. Artifacts are details added to the sound by diverse steps of processing. A bit less precision in sampling, a slightly lower bit depth and a slightly reduced sample rate can reduce artifacts quite often. I follow my own advice, and after resetting the higher partials, which are not needed here, the three sounds are quite similar, and the time synth sound is ready for further tweaking. But we are not through with the matter yet. We have to find out how the parameters filter and channel in the convert section of the edit sub-window of the sampler work. Only if we know even these things, we are able to come to a quite fast workflow concerning our sound works. Let's go for it then. The channel parameter is quite self-explanatory. It determines whether the right or the left or both stereo channels are analyzed. As long as both channels carry the same content and are in phase, the channel parameter doesn't influence the authenticity of the result of the converting process. But be careful. Most of the time, the two stereo channels are at least not in phase, which leads to different results with different channel adjustments here in the convert window. The filter parameter is more interesting. It determines how many of the highest frequencies in the spectrum of the sound in the sampler shall not be taken into account in the converting process. Or to be a bit more precise, how many of these highest frequencies shall not be calculated in the Fourier transformation. The numbers 1 to 7 are not the absolute numbers of partials that shall not be calculated. It's simply that 0 means no partial, not even the highest one is excluded. For example, 1 means some partials are excluded, 2 means some more partials are excluded, and so on. And with an adjustment of 7, there are quite a lot of high partials excluded from the transformation process. But excluding higher partials from the process of converting does not at all mean that there are less higher partials in the resulting sound, in the spectrum of the resulting sound. It means that the resulting waveform and the resulting spectrum and the development in time differ from those which would have been gained with different filter adjustments. That may be a bit hard to understand. Therefore, let me try to explain what a Fourier transformation actually does, and even a bit of the how does it do that in simple words and nearly without any mathematics. No, really without mathematics. After that, I'm going to look at some simple wave shapes to demonstrate the practical use of all of that stuff. At first, some clarification concerning the terms. FFT, the fast Fourier transformation, is an algorithm, a piece of code of software. This software executes the mathematical process called Fourier transformation. I'm not going to explain coding here. What I'm going to try now is explaining the mathematical process, the Fourier transformation, in simple, non-mathematical words. The Fourier transformation takes a series of waveform samples, let me call them wavetables, and transforms them into a series of spectra which contain adequate partials, meaning a lot of individual sine waves. And now to the how does this happen? Each waveform is analyzed, and the Fourier transformation calculates which sine waves with which amplitudes are needed to build up the wave in the wavetable. The real challenge is the amplitude, or are the amplitudes, because we do know already which sine waves we need, what is the same as which frequencies we need, because you will remember one sine wave equals one certain frequency in the spectrum. We need all the following sine waves, the fundamental, let me call it f, 2 times f, 3 times f, 4 times f, and so on. All integer multiples of the fundamental. Some of these sine waves frequencies may have an amplitude of 0, though. Why does every stable waveform consist of only integer multiples of the fundamental? Well, let me show what happens to the wave when the contributing sine waves are not integer multiples. I add 3 sine waves together. The higher 2 sine waves are integer multiples of the lowest sine wave. The single signal analyzer on the left shows the resulting wave. It is a stable wave. The 3 signal analyzers on the right show the 3 added sine waves. Now I change the frequencies of the upper 2 sine waves in a way that they are not integer multiples of the fundamental anymore, and the resulting wave stops being stable. It's not one certain wave anymore, but a sequence of a couple of waves, of similar waves here, similar but not the same. I talk about phenomena like these and without constituents of sound and about the constituents of a sound that are not integer multiples of the fundamental in my FMPM, frequency modulation, phase modulation workshop on one of my other YouTube channels more in detail. So, therefore, I can say, if we have a stable wave of any shape, then its constituent parts are sine waves with frequencies that are integer multiples of the frequency of the fundamental. Well, that's settled. Now for the rest of the problem. As I'm not teaching mathematics here, I put it in simple words. Knowing the amplitude of the wave I'm analyzing at a certain moment, and knowing each possible frequency of the constituent parts, the sine waves, I calculate which amplitudes all of these sine waves can have at this certain moment to come to the analyzed point on the curve of the analyzed wave. Okay, there are a lot of different possible combinations, you will say, and yes, there are, if we look at only one single point. But forget about that aspect here, or would you rather deal with with the formulas like that? Oh, okay, no, of course not. Sorry. My example shares the insufficiency of all illustrations of mathematical processes, but it will serve well when we have to answer questions of musical relevance, as you will see in a moment. Well, and now we have to continue calculating points for each possible point on the wave's curve to get the series of spectra I mentioned above. And thanks to Sir Isaac Newton, that it's not an adventure without any end. Our opening question was, why do I still see all these high frequencies in the spectrum, even if I have set the filter parameter in the convert section of the sampler to 7? Well, the answer should be easy now. What I determine with the filter settings in the convert section does not directly concern the wave's audible and visible spectrum, but the upper limit to which I let my Fourier transform calculate constituent sine waves, possibly even far beyond audible frequencies. The higher I set this limit, for example with the filter setting of 0 meaning no limit, the more accurate the reconstructed wave gets. But accuracy is not what we normally want. Because of aesthetic reasons, as well as because of the fact that accuracy also means reconstructing flaws and mistakes the CMI has made by sampling the imported wave. Therefore, we get a better saw wave with a less accurate reproduction, with excluding the higher constituents from being taken into account. I exclude unwanted details, unwanted flaws and artifacts from the reconstruction of the imported wave. But I get far more interesting sounds with these inaccuracies and flaws and artifacts in them quite often. The last subject of today's video is purely musical, concerns only the artwork of sound design. No mathematical hints, no technical details anymore now. It's the question of the character of a sound. What in a sound rouses our fantasy, rouses the fantasy of our listeners? Well, and rouses the fantasy of the CMIV. What typical flaws puts the CMI into the sound typical for what I feed it with? Why do I want to know that? Why do I want to discover that? Well, because I want to do artwork, sonic artwork, music with the sounds I have recorded or otherwise gained. Some examples how the simplicity and inaccuracy of the CMI can help us finding what we are looking for. First example, boiling water recorded with the microphone in the kettle. You hear the original. and now the arty character of this sound as the CMI sees it. Next example, rolling marbles in an empty bathtub. The transposed original first. And now the time synth version of it after a simple conversion. Next example, a microwave recorded with a piezo microphone at the back of the housing of the microwave generator. And this is what the CMI thinks is the character of the sound. The next sound comes from a recording of a washing machine. The microphone was in the washing machine. The CMI's time synth thinks I should use it like that. A last example, it's water flowing into a ewer. And CMI's view of the things. With a little bit of working on the details in each of the shown examples, I got some really useful material for the project I'm working on at the moment. And stop. That's all for today. Enough for one video. I've done my job again. Now it's your turn. Your job is easier than mine. Just like, subscribe and donate. And if you don't like this video, well, never mind. Just like, subscribe and donate. And in case you don't know why, just go to your grocer's shop. They will explain it to you. Enjoy your day. Rolf.